Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live broadcast, live stream hosted by our charitable project, Basket of Opportunities, or Лукошко Возможностей. And my husband and I have started this project in the beginning of the lockdown here in New York to support our Russian community and to keep the certain level of emotional, physical, and mental health in order to survive through those turbulent times, to provide opportunities to grow in different directions, to learn about amazing projects created by amazing people, to occupy kids, and so on and so forth. And we keep doing it. And today is another wonderful opportunity for our audience to learn about an amazing project created by amazing people. And I'm so excited to introduce our guest, our speaker from Oregon, Michael Bodkin. Bodkin. I'm sorry, we just have a famous name like that, so it just popped out in the wrong time. Michael Bodkin, who is a psychotherapist, a wilderness guide, and who has been the executive director of Rites of Passage for the past 40 years, I think, right? This is a nonprofit organization.
Yeah. Since 1986, I've been the director.
Since 1986. And Michael is going to talk about his amazing program, and I hope our audience will learn from it and enjoy the talk. So your turn, Mike. Welcome.
Okay.
And I'm so excited to have you here. I'm going to be on the background of checking questions, so you'll be the one leading the talk, but I'll be there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marina. Thanks for the invitation. Marina, I got your name wrong too. So this work we're engaged in is quite powerful in many ways. It began with a man back in the 1970s who went off on his own to try to sort his life out and got some advice from a Native American and ended up doing a solo in the wilderness, and it changed him a lot. And eventually he started this project, and they worked with kids and then expanded into adults. The work in the core program, there's many different aspects and teachings in it, but the core program takes people to the wilderness to mark a ceremony or a conscious time of solo time in nature, solo time on your own in nature. For the way we do it, typically would be 3 days and nights. That's the longer program. 3 days and nights alone, in a very simple way. We have people, there's 3 key elements that challenge people. One is the solitude. The second is the fact that most people will fast, or they won't eat, but they'll drink water. And the third thing is that we'll have minimal shelter. We'll teach people how to put up a simple tarp rather than use a tent, so you don't seal out nature. And living like that with Mother Nature over the passing of morning, sunrise, and sunset, and nights, and then the day begins, a person begins to realize who they are and what they're about, and they start to reflect on their life. And they also have all this, what we call it, a mirror of nature, all around them constantly. The wind blowing, or an animal that comes and hangs out with you, or the sight of a hawk flying in the wind, or the plant species that talk to you. And you enter essentially an altered state of consciousness out there, and have incredible dreams, and understanding comes over time out there. And then the challenge is always, how do you come home with what you've learned? So the program actually focuses on extensively on both preparation for the program, for the solo, and then afterwards on integration of how you'll make use of it. Marina, are you still there?
I am here. I
So-
am here.
You could suggest other things for me to talk about or expand on. I could go on, but I'll check in with you.
Maybe first let's do an overview of the programs that you have, because you do have a different length, program of different length, both online and live. So maybe let's just talk about that first.
Sure. So the longer program, it's a 9-day program. We call it a wilderness quest. And it has been influenced, I should say, all our work by Native American teachers who we've had contact with over the years, but it's not an attempt to reproduce a Native American ceremony in any way. It's just that they have taught us a lot that we could use in our own way. That's the longest program, is the Wilderness Quest. We are also offering, we used to offer it live. Right now we're doing it online. We're calling it a solo quest program. There's one completing this week. That's a 6-week online program where people spend the first 3 weeks in preparation of 3 meetings online. And so everybody joins the program from their home, and then they find a nature area near where they live and spend a sunrise to sunset one day between the 3rd and 4th meetings, engaging in a solo with the same intention and the same kind of focused purpose that we have on the longer program. And then the last 3 meetings are the return qualities of unpacking what happened and understanding it. That's also a really powerful program. I was very surprised to find that what we lost in the sense of going to a wilder place than near one's home and we lost some of the connectivity of the group that happens when you meet live. We made up for that by the longer set of meetings and by people picking a place that's more familiar to them so they could incorporate it right into their home. It's a very good program. We also do training of different qualities. We do a program on the 4 directions, which is a whole teaching series about some of the underpinnings of the work that involves exercises and learning in nature. That's also a 6-week online program at this time. And that's a really rich program also, in which every week you get to go out and do some kind of intentional learning in nature based on the model that we use. There's also an expanded training program which people enter after they've done the Wilderness Quest, that if they want to learn about how to guide people in this work. We've been doing that for many years with small groups of trainees. I think we also do men's trips and women's trips. The program finishing right now online is a women's solo quest with the 1-day in nature solo. For many years, we've done men's wilderness quests with the full solo. We had to cancel last June because of the COVID virus. So that's influenced us. I think that's the bulk of the programs. One other, I've had quite a few. I did one yesterday with a woman in Switzerland. We've been doing 1-day guided programs with people. You don't get the benefit of the whole community then, which is helpful, but it's still a very good program, and it can be quite powerful, which is I'll individually prepare people to spend a full day in nature and have them come back and we'll decode or unpack their story afterwards. That's also on the website under online programs. That's done by appointment. I think that's the bulk of the programs.
Okay, thank you so much. Can we talk now maybe in depth, in detail about your 9-day program? Like just describe what is happening from the point that people arrive and the first meeting to the point when you hug them goodbye.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start even before they arrive. I'll start when people find the program They see it online and they think, I might want to do this. It's quite scary. It's not like we are working with a select group of long experienced wilderness people who think, oh, this could be a fun alternative. Some people come with that, but an awful lot of people get pulled into this work because of the promise that it holds for a rich knowledge and growth, but they don't have wilderness experience. So we might get a call from a woman in Kansas. I remember one who called and said, I've never camped. Can I still do this? So initially people check the program out, and if they feel like they can take that leap, they register for it. And then we have 1 or 2 online meetings with the group before we ever meet in the field. We cover, there's a handbook that we'll send out with registration, which is over 60 pages of material. And it's very helpful for orienting. It has equipment, it has a lot of logistical material in there. And then it has the sort of more spiritual, more psychological ends of the program are sketched out as well. So in the time before the program gets together, people are gathering equipment, thinking about what they're doing, what they need to bring with them, and orienting toward it. And we're also having them write about what this is about for them. So when we meet them on the first afternoon, actually, of the first day, they arrive from all over. And we go to remote areas, so everybody needs to have a vehicle of some sort. In some areas, it requires a high clearance vehicle in some places, depending on where we go. Typically, until COVID, we had people sharing vehicles, which means 3 or 4 people might share a vehicle rental if they were flying in. In the time of COVID, it's amazing that we're still able to do this work live. We stopped for many months, and then we got permission to continue from the park we're working with, Death Valley National Park, if we had a set of protocols. And one of the protocol issues is that everybody has to drive their own car, because we can't have people risk infecting each other. And another is that we'll have people 6 feet apart in camp. So when we meet and talk, we'll just meet sitting 6 feet apart, and we've reduced the group size. So that's some of the immediate thing. So we'll get together, the group will meet, and we typically would go over a lot of different combination of practical and other issues. Practical includes information on what we call flora fauna, which is what's this terrain like that we're going into? What's the animal and plant life about? Is there anything that can hurt me there? What do I need to pay attention to? The second practical theme is, the second practical theme would be terrain, like is it hilly? Where is it safe to walk? What happens if you get lost? Things like that. And a third thing has to do with weather, like how do you deal with heat or cold or rain and maybe lightning and thunder. So we'll practice, go over all that material, plus a section on first aid, and we'll teach people how to tie up a tarp. I mentioned earlier that they're going without a tent out into the backcountry. So we'll have them practice tying up a tarp, and we'll sit that first afternoon when we meet and really get oriented, get to talk to each other, and ask always, almost at every meeting, it's a variation of the question of, so how are you and what is the reason you're here? What's happening with that? And that will evolve in the first 3 days. It will change, sometimes quite drastically. One of the great advantages of having a group is people listen to each other and they learn something. So maybe a person speaks about a deeper intention, or something they say, the other person in the group says, boy, listening to you, I realize there's a whole other piece of what I'm doing here. And so they're very helpful. The group is what we call a container, a safe container. And we have agreements on confidentiality. We have agreements that people will listen to each other. They're actually what we call council agreements. And a couple of them that are very potent is speak from the heart and listen from the heart. So the group really attends to each other. And in doing that, it builds a place where people can access the meaning. So that's kind of day one. Day two, we've been at a campground the very first night. We pack up and go in the backcountry, and the travel and the excitement of learning about this wild place. We head into the backcountry with all our water and some food, and we set up a base camp. And then once we're there, we work with I mentioned a program we offer on the 4 directions, where we'll do a lot of teaching on that on the second day to help orient people. Now, those things involve learning about ourselves in the cycle of nature. Where are we in our lives? What's the season that we're in? What is it that's changing for us? The program we do, and the name of our organization is Rites of Passage. This program is a rite of passage. And these are ceremonies to mark life changes and meaningful events that are largely missing right now in the modern culture. But we know that our ancestors and those who came before us used these ceremonies to make meaning out of their lives and to be of value in their own cultures, to find out what their gifts were, to grow up and take their place. It's very easy to see this in less industrial cultures. It's much harder to see it in ours. One of the principles in more indigenous cultures is that you can't waste human talent. So there's not enough people with gifts to go around to just ignore them. And we need them. So one of the questions is, what are you about? What do you need to work through or to discover about yourself? And so it's very interesting that as people do this kind of inner work, they start feeling that call both to heal themselves of anything that's left over, like from childhood or from bad experience, but also toward the birth of a new self. So a rite of passage marks the symbolic death of an old life and the beginning of a new life. And it isn't just gradual, it's a ceremony to break off what one has been living, to say it's done, and to welcome in the new. So a lot of the time we spend on day 2 and 3 is toward identifying what's dying and what's being born. What are you bringing in? For most people, they come to the program knowing this is already going on, and so it's just articulating it, getting deeper. But sometimes people really make big discoveries just when they're out there at the beginning, before the solo, about what this means. It really is person to person. Our job as guides is both physical safety as guides and emotional safety, to help people to make these discoveries and feel comfortable looking into it. The morning of day 3, people go out and find their place. They spend a morning looking for the place they're going to go on a solo. We also have a complex but beautiful buddy safety system where the buddies will check in with each other through a central place, like we call it a stone pile, where you'd leave a stone to say, I'm okay. But you don't see each other unless there's a problem. If there's a problem, if your buddy didn't show up, then you go look for them. But otherwise, for the most part, what you get is a communication that says, I know you're looking after me and I'm looking after you. It's a lovely addition to the idea of solo. You're out there alone, but you're not really alone. You're just on your own in the midst of this group of people. We've had that come up on youth trips where kids actually started singing at sunset, and they would start singing from all the peaks around the area, and you'd hear all the voices. They're solo, but they're together. So that's the last day in base camp, is going and finding your place, and then spending hours in the afternoon or early evening with a final circle of preparedness for the solo. And then on the 4th morning at dawn, we get people up before dawn, and they pack their gear, and we meet them, and we ceremonially send them out across a threshold, you're out on your solo now. You're out in the other world as far as we're concerned for 3 days and nights. And then we wait in base camp for them. Unless there's a crisis or an emergency, they always can come back and talk to us if they have to. Or the rules are not rigid. They're guidelines to help a person, but safety comes first. And also sometimes it's really important for people to ask for help if they get stuck. That can be a learning in itself. Then it would be on the seventh morning. So days 4, 5, and 6 are solo. And so the seventh morning of the program, people return to base camp. They usually come in pairs with their buddy, and we welcome them back in ceremonially, bring them back into the world they left behind, the return. And when everybody's back, we have a feast for breakfast. And then later in the day, we hear their stories. We begin to reflect and help them to integrate what's taken place here. The 8th day, we'll leave base camp, return to the campground, and then we'll work with a return council in which we're asking, what are you bringing back? What happened out there now that you look back on it? What changed? Who is this person who's going home now? What are your commitments to this new life? And that pretty much wraps the program. The following morning, we'll just do some final acknowledgement of the changes and connection with each other, and then say goodbye.
Wow. It gives me goosebumps, especially when I heard about kids singing. I do have a lot of questions, and we have a couple of questions from our audience.
Yes.
Liz is asking, what kinds of preparations do you make? I think she means before the trip, right, Liz? Please confirm. Like my understanding is that, do we need to be prepared before we come? What do we need to do?
Yeah, well, you'll need to gather your gear, and we have an equipment list. And we actually hold an online meeting to talk about all the equipment, just to be sure that everybody's clear. It's not complex. You need a backpack, you need a tarp, you'll need a tent for the campground because there's nowhere to put tarps up there. You'll need to bring some water. That's a big one. We have typically people bring 6 gallons, which they use some of on the solo and some is contributed to the group needs. At this point, we're talking about 10 gallons because we would prefer not to use group water collectively. It's safer to just have your own water, things like that. It's not very complex stuff. You need some boots. So part of the preparation is gathering your gear. Part of the preparation is thinking about and writing about why you want to do this. And it starts with a form we have which asks a few questions about you and your background, and which you write about this. Given COVID, we've been having 2 pre-trip meetings online and covering more of the safety stuff. But usually we would cover that the first day in base camp. Physical preparation, it depends. The old thing we had, I don't know that it's in the handbook, but it was our standard was you should be able to walk 2 miles on an even surface without getting exhausted or out of breath. So you don't need to be in any kind of top-notch shape. We drive into base camp pretty much. There's maybe a 1/4 mile walk to bring gear into the actual site, but it's very brief. And how far you go from base camp to your site is up to you. It can be up to 2 miles. But it doesn't have to be anywhere very far. It could be 10 minutes of walk. So you don't have to be an athlete or in great shape to do it, but we will have a health questionnaire. We'll find out what kind of issues people have. We've had people with some fairly severe health issues who are able to do the program, sometimes with a little modification, as long as it's safe. So there's not much on that level. If you're really out of shape, we would recommend starting to walk and just get to where you can walk a ways without getting worn out. What else? Yeah, and for some people, the preparation involves thinking about some of these if there's a physical concern, like if they are taking certain medications, they would want to talk to their doctor about the fast. Is it safe for them to go without food? But going without food is one of those elements that really adds to the program. But you could, if you can't go without food, you could go with less food or with simpler food. So we can modify that as well. Mostly it's show up. Think about what's happening in your life and show up with the gear you need, and you'll be ready to start to prepare for it.
Thank you. And another question from Liz, and she wants to know if those groups are integrated, both male and female.
Right. So, and I didn't really mention too much about this when I talked a few minutes ago, but one thing is we do have some youth groups that are largely seniors in high school. Some are juniors in high school, but mostly seniors. And we've been working with a number of schools over the years. Currently, there's one school we've been with for 11 years. We're planning 2 programs with them this year, God willing, because it's a complicated process for them and for us to work out the safety at this point. But so we divide among youth and adults is one thing. And then we do have some programs just for women and some programs just for men. When we're not dealing with the COVID virus, we do a full men's trip once a year. And we had a Russian man on it, who's a mutual friend of ours, came on a couple of years ago. In Colorado, we run that program. We've had women's trips, but we don't have a women's field program right now. But we have had a women's online program running for the last few weeks. So it can be divided by gender and it can be divided by age.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some reflections on what you said. It reminds me, when I was listening to the program, it reminds me of Joseph Campbell's work.
Yes.
Is it a little bit similar? Because it seems like when you do your solo and you fasting, this is where you really meet your demons, right? This is
Very
where
much.
you meet everything what is inside of you hiding. And but you need to hear this inner calling before you come, right?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that's why it isn't for everybody. And it isn't just for people who are very athletic or wilderness oriented. It's for people who feel the inner call. That's absolutely true. And without that, it doesn't work. But that'll work even if you've never set foot in nature before. If you really hear the call, we trust that. Yes, you meet your demons if they're there. Sometimes they come up and sometimes they're not what you thought they were. 3 that I can name offhand that come up frequently for people. One is loneliness. That being alone for that period of time brings up a sense of loneliness. The second is boredom, which is being alone for that period of time means you have a lot of time to fill, and you start realizing how much of your life you spend being distracted and not really being present. And the third one is fear, which is things, once you're alone, you no longer have the bright lights of civilization, that you realize you're fearful in nature, that you're not a comfortable guest, and you start to work with that. What's interesting is each of these demons that I just named, and there are many others, each of them has a tremendous gift. Loneliness is the teacher of giving. And I just can't tell you how many times, particularly with young people, but not only with young people, a person will go out, they'll feel this huge loneliness, and they'll come back and say, I realize how much my mother and father have given me. I love them so much. I feel so lonely without them. I want to go home and tell them this. And it's actually, for a young person, it's stepping from childhood into adulthood by going through their loneliness. they realize that they need to give back. They say, I'm going to go home and I'm going to start doing chores without being asked, because they see it from the other perspective when they've gone through the solo. That's loneliness. Boredom just wakes us up. We start to realize that we have this precious time. It's a really good teacher also. And people start to do things like write poetry or pay really close attention to the world around them. They get lost in the sound of the wind or something. It's a doorway through our typical, especially in this era with phones and with videos, that cutting all that out is sensory deprivation, but that leads to a whole other world. And fear may be the most potent of all, that everything we fear becomes a gateway to courage and to self-understanding and to the courage to live. So often we'll say that the most fearful person in the group becomes the most courageous, because the person with the most fear is risking the most by going out there. They're trembling, they're crying, and yet they're just gorgeous. And when they come back and they find that courage and they realize that they've done it, it's phenomenal what happens. And they're teachers for the people in the group who maybe are just that afraid but aren't showing it in that way. So the person who's willing to be honest and be real with their fear is a great gift to everyone.
Thank you.
And there are others. Another demon that people face is depression, and a sense of living a half life. And one thing the nature brings out is wildness. And you can go out and scream and shout and run around and feel really alive and realize that you don't want to live in this narrowed down box. But yes, you meet your demons. Sometimes we call them your dragons, the things that keep you down or hold you back. It is a Joseph Campbell journey of the hero. And in his archetypes, in the way he describes it, the hero goes out there to conquer something, but then they bring something back, the golden fleece.
The gifts. Yes.
The gifts that you carry are what's so important. One thing I had mentioned to Marina that she thought was significant is a story from when we were invited to Russia. And we worked with a group of business people, mostly, but not entirely, from St. Petersburg. Some were from Moscow. And we had a group out. We took a boat across to a shore on the sea. And I'm forgetting the name now. The deep lake, in Siberia.
Baikal? Lake
Baikal. And we had an amazing place there. It was so wild. And we were working with people there. And there was one woman who worked for the Bank of Moscow. These were successful, and some were entrepreneurs, some were just good business people. And this woman was very traditionally Russian and was very suspicious of us, but she came because she trusted our contacts in Russia who had referred all these people who had suggested it. And then I started telling her about the purpose of the program was not to get richer or get more for you, but to learn how to give what you had in a way that benefited others. But to do that, you needed to discover more about yourself. So the inner journey was necessary, but it wasn't the end point. And she felt so relieved to hear that. She just said, I thought all you Americans were all about me, me, me. And this feels like I can get behind this. This was really an indigenous viewpoint. I'm sorry to say it's not the mainstream European or American viewpoint, but it is there in those cultures. It's just not the main one that we see reflected these days. But in this work, that really resonated with her, that the reason you go into the dark, the Joseph Campbell story, is not just to be a conquering hero, but to find out what you're capable of giving back. And then you must return for that And the return is the third part of the program, or the rite of passage. And that's when you bring it back for everyone else. The return is the hardest part. And we tell people that, and they don't believe us. They never believe us, because when you first go in, you're scared, and it's very unfamiliar, and it's like getting on a boat that's pitching all different ways, and you're just trying to get your sea legs. And then you spend these days of solo where you settle down and you discover that you're in love with the world, and that you could live in nature forever. It brings you everything you need, and beauty is almost every moment, even in the middle of a storm. It's just gorgeous. And so you get that, and then you reach that point in the Joseph Campbell story where he says, I don't want to go back. That's toward the end of The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He has a chapter called Refusal of Return, which is where you're just saying, why would I want to go back to that world? And that's the challenge. So getting people back in base camp, then after the solo, they'll say, no, I feel so high, or there's no problem, or I'm just going to hang out here. I'm going to bring the state back with me. But it's not so simple, because it's actually a tremendous challenge requiring just as much courage as coming out, is going back and returning with those gifts. And you can imagine in our culture that when you get home, like in Joseph Campbell's stories and in traditional cultures, when you go home with those gifts, the people gather around you and they say, what happened? What happened to you out there? What did you learn? What are you bringing us? We had this experience about maybe 8 years ago. We were invited to visit the Mohawk community, the Mohawk Native Americans in New York State. And we actually flew into Syracuse and then drove to Akwesasne, which is the headquarters or the center of the Mohawk Nation. And we got to witness and participate these 3 young men who went through a Mohawk Vision Quest. And they were gearing up to a longer program. The first year they do 1 day, then 2, then 3, then they finished with 4 days. And these young men had just done a 2-day solo. They were about 15 or 16 years old. They really use this ritual in their culture. It's a main source. And so the young men were in the community, came out of the 2-day ritual, and about 150 people showed up to welcome them and say, we see you, we recognize you, we know you've done something important, welcome to our community. For me, who had been doing these programs and sending people home to nothing, to what did you do? And come on, get back in line with being who we know you to be. This was mind-boggling. So the extra challenge in our culture is to return to a world that doesn't recognize what you've done or understand its meaning. It takes a lot of courage and strength to do that, and it takes longer to integrate. A man named John Young, who's a wilderness teacher, also spoke about this, and he called it the wall of grief, that when you come back, it's like a river you have to cross to come back to your culture. And you walk through that river, which is like partly formed of all the tears of the pain that the society is in, and you have to cross back through it to return. So it's not an easy process, but it's one with great meaning, and it gives people a sense of hope and purpose to do it.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
And can you say a few words about Native American traditions? Liz is asking, how do Native American traditions play into program? And I do know that you changed the name of the program from Vision Quest to Wilderness Quest, especially for this reason. Can you talk about it a little bit? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not a spokesperson for Native American traditions. Let's just be clear on that. I can talk about how our connection with Native Americans influenced us. And I can say something about what's beyond my knowledge and competence. I can just point to it. At the very beginning of the program in the 1970s, I mentioned a teacher that founded this program, who had gone out in nature. He was at a change point in his life, and he found a Native American to help him. And then he came back and he realized this was so powerful. He did it. It was a vision quest. And by the way, vision quest is the name that's been used by anthropologists to describe a fairly broad range of ceremonial practices across the Americas. That is to say, from the East Coast to the West Coast, up and down, probably into Mexico and maybe South America. I don't know enough to know exactly what the traditions look like, but it's a conglomerate term. It doesn't describe what the Lakota people do. They have their own name for it, but it describes a broad range of things. And I've even seen the term used for Africa in a couple of books on some of their ceremonies. So that's been the history of the words in English, vision quest. So Stephen, the teacher, the American guy, came back and started this program, thought he would work with young people in transition and then later adults. And a Native American teacher contacted him and said, I have some stuff that you really need if you want to do this program you're doing, and offered. And I think Stephen and his wife both joined this man's teaching lodge for a couple of years at least. I don't know the details on how long they were in it, and I know he was a mentor to Stephen. And he presented this whole body of material that helped people to understand themselves more. It turned out that this man, although he was from a particular tribe, that the teachings he had came from a different source, but they were indigenous. And they got brought into rites of passage right at the beginning, really, and became part of what we use. So we honor that man. We honor the fact that we were allowed to use this material. But this was 40 years ago. This was 40 years ago, and it started to influence how we worked with people, and then we evolved it over time. It isn't the same as what was given to us because we've had so many years of applying this material. It was never our intention to do a Native American ceremony. We incorporated universal elements that were affiliated with the vision quest, such as spending solo time, being alone on the earth. And we had other Native teachers who gave us advice. I've had a few myself over the years. One of the most important for me was a man we used to visit for 15 years down in the desert. He was an elder of the Shoshone people, and his name was Corbin Harney, and he was a friend. And I just really want to name him because he was very useful and generous to us. We never asked him for how to do a ceremony or what to do, but we would share with him, and he would give us feedback, and he would meet with our groups sometimes and give others in the group feedback, and it was very lovely of him to do that. So these are some of the influences we've had as we developed our program. Our program was influenced just as much by Joseph Campbell as by Native Americans, but the form of it was this land we live on. Hold on. I just heard that Joseph Biden has been confirmed have won the election. I'm happy about that. To move on, the form it took, such as the solo and the sense of being guided in this solo and having it be about a life change and meaning, that really was influenced by what we saw of Native American, or pan-cultural vision quest use. Later on, years later, things changed in America, that Native people started really having more of a voice and a defense of their culture, and they felt angry that others were using parts of it without permission and distorting it perhaps as well. And we made I think, a wise decision to stop using the term vision quest because most people now thought of that as a strictly Native ceremony. even though Native tribes never called what they did Vision Quest, they called it by the name of their own particular ceremony. It gave people the impression that we were empowered to do a Native ceremony, and we didn't want that misunderstanding. So we changed the term to Wilderness Quest, which reflected our tradition, which we've been doing for all these years anyway. And that's what it came to. We still use the teaching of the 4 directions that we were given. We still thank those teachers, and we're still grateful for people like Corbin. As another aside about our connection with the indigenous community, we were asked a few years ago, not only did we go to the Mohawk people, but we were asked a couple of years before that to take some of their, a couple of their men on a quest. And we had a good relationship with them, and they found real value in what we were doing. So I feel pretty confident about where we are. It hurts when people accuse us of ripping off their culture. That happens occasionally, not very often, but it does happen. But we've also had a lot of support in the indigenous community from people like Corbin, from others that we've met along the way. I have a lot of stories I could tell about that, but that's enough to give you a sense of the journey we've been on with that. And still periodically, once in a while, I'll get an email or a phone call from a Native person, and they'll check in on us and say, well, what are you really doing? And we'll tell them, and they'll say, well, okay, as long as you don't misrepresent it, we're good with it.
Got you. Thank you for sharing that. I was thinking about the part, if I were the guide, the wilderness guide on your team, what would be my favorite part in the journey? And I think it would be looking in the eyes of people who came back from solo. What is your experience with that? Like what do you see? How do they change?
That's wonderful. So I agree. Looking into those, what we call desert eyes, those eyes that have dropped into clarity, and there's no longer all these competing thoughts. They're just there in this beautiful, beautiful way. Marina, I can say with some assurance, because I've had people from different traditions on, like people who are deep Buddhist practitioners, people who are deep into spirituality, that this work does provide an enlightenment experience, but it doesn't stay at enlightenment. You have to come back. And so just that glimpse of that pure truth in a person is fantastic. Another part that I really love a great deal is listening to their stories, understanding how nature guided them and how they faced their fears and how they walked their way through this heroic personal journey to understanding. I remember, I have so many stories like this. There's a woman years ago who came out, and the immediate event preceding her coming out was that she had split up with a partner she'd been with for several years, and she was in a lot of grief. And she wrote this beautiful journal that she later shared with us and actually posted online on her own site, where there was a storm and the weather changed and everything felt like had been lovely, and now it was raining or even hailing. And she had this insight that everything changed, but nothing was really lost. And she could let go and say goodbye and welcome the next stage of her life. And the storm that she was frightened of had brought on this awareness of the changes of her life. And so it was such a beautiful story. And we're all kind of crying listening to it. It was just magnificent. It's the kind of awareness that you could take years and years to get to in therapy, and yet it arrives in 3 days on the solo. That always blows me away. And I can say with real assurance and genuine and not fake humility that it's not us. It's not the guides. The guides, if we're doing our job, are creating the right attitude and container, but it's nature. that's doing the talking here. And that always blows me away.
I can totally relate to that. It's just so wonderful. Michael, talking about coming back and all of this gifts that people bring to the community, do you do any follow-ups of how they are doing out there? Like, and when, like in a month, in a week?
Yeah, we do. About a month, sometimes a little longer after the return, we'll do a video call with everyone. You know, when the program began in the 70s, it was all local. So we would actually sit down and meet with people. But, and we continued, we actually had a big old van where we would drive everybody to the wilderness site. So you had to find your way to the program back when. That ended, that ended after a group came in with 3 men from Argentina and the wife of one of them who lived in, he and his wife lived in Florida, but his buddies in Argentina, he was Argentinian, came to Florida, and then they flew out to the West Coast, and then we drove them for 10 hours to Death Valley. And then we realized it would have been so much easier if they had just flown down into the, you know, to Las Vegas and had made their own arrangements. So, so yes, we used to have very in-person meetings with people and really gather them. But as the program became more dispersed and we had people from all over, we're holding those meetings online. I should also say that it's not just California. We have held programs pretty much all over the world. Besides the program that we did in Russia, we have done programs. Years ago, we did a program in Mexico. We've done programs in Australia. We've done programs in Denmark, which actually had a quest going out in Sweden. We did a program in the Czech Republic. I haven't named all of them. There's more.
Hawaii, I think you mentioned Hawaii.
Well, Hawaii was a particular group. It was a group of Russians and one Lithuanian, another one of those business groups that we were working with. And yes, they did a solo in the Hawaiian backcountry that was pretty amazing. Yes, so we have had the chance to travel where people are. Of course, this isn't where these people live, but we met them there. But by and large, a lot of our programs are in the States, and so we have guides that we've trained who are all over. We have a guide in New York State that we've talked over the years about bringing a program out that way to work with her.
That would be wonderful. That was my next question, because I'm so excited if we have people interested, especially I would like to do it for youth. Yes. Because it's incredibly needed here, I think, for
Yes, totally. Let me tell you about the youth work we've done, and I think that's an important topic. Is that okay to go into that a bit?
Absolutely.
So years ago, back in the late 70s, early 80s, the program got funding, and the funding was this kind of almost like comic story that this woman in this little county, very wealthy little county in California where we happen to be living, and the program happened to be founded there, she left money to a trust fund when she died that was to be used for local nonprofits. Have I mentioned that Rites of Passage is a federally chartered nonprofit? So donations and such are used for scholarships and are tax deductible for what it's worth. So this money ballooned in value after she died because it was all in oil stocks. This is the joke. So it became this immense gift in this little county, and Rites of Passage living in that county applied for it and got funding. But it wasn't all that much money, but it allowed them to run a youth program. And they would actually could sponsor the kids, and they would have a team going around to the schools saying, do you want to go out and do this radical program? And a bunch of kids did, and so they would take them out to the desert and bring them back, and it changed their lives. But the funder never understood the program. It was weird for them. They made the administrators do follow-up to prove that something happened. They actually used a psychological instrument called the Tennessee Self-Concept Scale, which was an academically approved instrument to prove that changes in self-concept in a positive way happened on this program. And they got the proof. They did pre and post, and it changed. Just like, I should mention, we worked with veterans for a while. That's a long story, but we had an all veterans quest, and we did a pre and post on the PTSD scale. And it showed a change of 75% or so change in any of the vets who were in PTSD, got out of PTSD after the program, who wouldn't have qualified for that classification. Big changes. But just like with the vets, the youth people, the administrators from the foundation who had the money were going, what the heck is this? We don't want this. In fact, I have a little story from later, many years later, when we didn't have that funding anymore. Someone from a local Sonoma County foundation got interested in our work. And I lent her a video about the youth work that had been made years ago with the youth program. It was a really good video. And I got to talk to her afterwards, and I said, what did you think? And she said, oh, I watched it with my teenage son, and we cried. It was so powerful. And I said, so do you think your son would want to do this? She said, I would never let him do that program. And that,
oh my God.
and that was what we were running into, is the kids were like, oh yeah. And the parents were like, oh no. And in fact, the administrators who were running the grant money were going, what the heck are you doing here? We had all kinds of strange feedback back years and years ago when we actually had that funding. So the funding ended, and it ended with the funder saying, we don't have enough good programs to fund here in Marin County. There are no good programs. So we're going to spend the money somewhere else. And as a result of breaking the terms of the trust, they lost control of the trust. There was a big lawsuit filed, and the county of Marin took over and spent the money on building big buildings and creating their own, what we call the edifice complex, which is having something to remember you by in brick and mortar. So the funding disappeared. And so we realized when we took control of the program a few years later, there was no money in it. We couldn't get federal funding or state funding. One of the reasons for this, it's worth mentioning this, Marina, because I worked in youth programs in different contexts for nonprofits for years and years. That was my real job, as I did this that was my money job. This was my passion. And what I found is that the funders really wanted to know about how many people you could serve. So if I told them about a trip that cost thousands of dollars to run and serve 10 kids, they would go, that's a waste of money. We want you to spend that money and serve 200 kids. And so think about breadth versus depth, right? So breadth is, I want every kid to get an inch worth of value, instead of I want 10 kids to get 10 feet worth of value. And we just couldn't find people who understood what we were offering that would pay for it, other than individual parents, et cetera, until we started working with schools. But the last thing about the depth breadth thing is when we got to the first time we worked with the school we work with now, which is Sonoma Academy, and their administrator, Ellie Dwight, wrote an article after we took 8 kids out and said it's changed the culture of the whole school. And yes, that's what it's supposed to do. 8 kids changed the culture of the school because they got such depth that when they came back to the school, they changed all the kids around them and they affected everybody's dialogue. But it's really hard to get, especially funders, to buy into that idea. So, and we also, to be honest, our program works on the idea of mentorship and initiation, that it takes elders, it takes people who are initiated to help young people discover who they are. And that wasn't the going theme. What was popular and still is was peer identification, peer-run programs. And so when we ran this idea through some of the funders, they'd say, well, yeah, have the kids guide the other kids on the program. We're going, it doesn't work that way. And right now, when we take kids out, they say, thank you for being there for me as an elder, because I don't have that. That's what I want. But the elders don't tell the kids what to think. They don't tell them what's important to them. They listen, and they help steer them back toward themselves. That's what's missing. So as of our program right now, if we want to do an all-teen program, it pretty much requires that we have a base. The base doesn't have to be a school, but it often is. So in that case, the administrators and the school staff say, we believe in this program and we're going to support it. What that means for Sonoma Academy is they provide buses or vans and drivers, and they drive all the kids down this trip down to the desert, and they hold them during that time, and then they give them to us to work with, and then they bring them home. And then when they get to the school, they have teachers who post groups for the kids to be able to check back in. So it's so very helpful. And that's what we've been doing for the last 11 years at this one school. We've worked with other schools over a period of time, but the current school that we've been with for a long time is the only one that's made a long-term commitment to it. If you asked why the other schools didn't continue, the quickest thing to talk about is politics. That's enough to just say, like, one school loved our program and said, the kids have gotten so much. And then I said, well, are we going to do it again? And they said, we don't know. And then it got into their kind of ringer of crazy who's getting what and who gets to do what. And we never got to work with them again. Fair enough. The other way young people can be on our programs is to come on the adult program as a young participant. We prefer them not to be in high school for that, but it's okay if they're seniors. Seniors or college students, we've gotten a lot of college students. We have had some high school students that really worked out beautifully with this model. The model is more of a range of ages on a program. Even on an adult trip, we will have a range from 20s through maybe 60s, typical. So people have different kinds of life experience. If we get an 18-year-old on that program, this happened on a Colorado men's trip, the older men on the trip really become uncles to that boy. And we got taught about that by the Mohawk that I mentioned earlier, the men who came on our program. On that trip, we had an 18-year-old who hadn't been able to do the trip at Sonoma Academy because of a conflict and who really wanted to come. So the following fall now, he graduated from high school. He came on the program as a young adult. And the Mohawk men were so aware of what this meant to him. And for example, when we returned from the field to town, they said, we need to get him something to remember this by. And so while the group was on time off, a bunch of us, including those Mohawk men, went to a little shop in town and bought him a hoodie that had the name of the town in Colorado on it, and we presented it to him in a surprise ceremony to honor what he had done. And that was using the other men in the group to help kind of anchor this program for him. And he just kept writing to us years later saying, I'll never forget that. That was a changing point in my life. We also, the impact it had on him was so strong that his father ended up coming on a quest a few years later, if you could believe that. We've had that happen quite a bit through the school, is that parents ended up coming later because their kids' stories move them so much. So that would be a way for young people. But besides schools, we can work with organized groups of 6 or more. We can work with churches. We have worked with the Catholic Church on one program. They actually sponsored a girl on a trip because she did a one-day program they invited us to do for their church group. And she wanted to go so much on the solo that they raised money for her, and she came out on the trip. So we could do a program through a church, through a school, through a town youth group, anything that says, we've got you. And then they can do the work, which is hard work, of talking to the parents and reassuring them and being the liaison to help do some of that organizational. What we found is if we try to do that one kid at a time to organize an entire youth group, it's just impossible. It's herding cats. If one kid said, I want to come, And then his father wrote in and said, I'm not going to allow my boy to do that. And it was back and forth. This was an 18-year-old who had the legal right to come, but his father was, I'm going to call the police. I am not having my kid on your trip. And so by working with a local team, we can say, talk to the leaders of this team. They know about the program. It is safe. It is real. It's genuine. And it takes all of the craziness out of it. So the two ways youth can participate is an all youth group that's organized a little bit locally, or like a school, or if they're old enough and they can get the support, they can sign up for an adult program. So we don't expect 8 kids on an adult program. 2 kids is good. And this happened a couple of years ago, or actually a year ago, on the youth trip. There were 2 spaces left, and these teen girls were calling us, the mothers actually, saying, do you have a program my girl can participate in? We checked with the school. We said, we have space, please. They said, okay. And the 2 teen girls joined who weren't part of the school and filled out that program and got a tremendous amount from it. That's the way we would work it with an adult trip that had a space. We would incorporate them into an existing group.
Thank you, Michael. I hope that somebody will be interested. We are definitely interested for our son, and
Yes.
Let's see. I try to share that in many groups who are about wilderness or nature, and let's see what comes out of it. Hopefully we can organize it on our coast, and you guys can come and do it, or your guide who is in New York State.
Can I share an actual story from a trip from a young girl?
Absolutely.
You know, it would be nice to give you a sense of how it might play out. This was the girl who was sent by her Catholic church. She was actually sent by her Catholic youth group. And the youth minister had called us and asked us to help them with a one-day program. And she was involved in that. And then she said, I got to do this. She felt the call. Nobody else in that one-day program, not that they got a lot from it, but she was the only one who said, I need to do the full program. So she came out with us. And on the second morning of the program, think about when it was. No, the third morning of the program. So it would have been the beginning of the third day. She showed up in base camp with her buddy. And she had come on what was an adult trip. This followed the model I was speaking of, that we had others in the group helping to take care of her. But her buddy was an adult woman on this trip. And the adult woman said, she's distraught, and I'm bringing her back to you as her buddy. And we said, that's fine. Thank you for bringing her. Now you can go back to your site. And the girl, we said, what's going on? And she was sobbing. And she said, I had a terrifying dream last night, and I need help with it. And we helped her unpack the dream in base camp. And she said, the dream was about my brother and my young brother. And I was afraid he was dying. And I was really scared. And my mother and father were in the dream. I should mention that she was from an immigrant family from Mexico. And so some of her cultural stuff was about her parents were workers. They weren't well educated, and they were lovely, hardworking people, but they were, what I would say, she felt their vulnerability in the American culture. She felt how challenging it was, and she felt such respect for them. So her dream, as we unpacked it, the meaning of it was, I'm afraid that if I grow up to be the person I can be, I'm going to abandon my family, and they need me. So she struggled with that, and we sorted out the meaning of the dream, and she realized there was a pathway through for her to find herself and still love and protect them. And she went back to her site. She had an amazing third night. She came back glowing and went home in the glow. And then a year later, I got a call from the high school saying, we want you to know something about what this girl is doing. She has started a cancer support group for people in the community. And she has gone to an assembly and ritually cut off her hair to donate to a wig for cancer victims. And as a result of that action, 50 other kids donated their hair. and they said, she's astonishing. She became a youth community leader. And it all came out of the quest. That was how she stepped into that next place. And she was fine. And what I mean by fine is she worked out her fears with her family and moved into her own truth. And this is often the truth with immigrants, that she straddled both cultures. She had gifts from her culture, and she had gifts to give and be part of the more mainstream culture that she could also put a foot in. We had a Chinese girl from China on the Sonoma Academy trip who was a student from China at the school, and she had a very similar experience, realizing that she was going to walk between those cultures and both receive and give from both cultures. So this is just a story about how the quest can help a person to find out who they are and to start making changes in the lives of themselves and others. Those things have me humbled. The girl with her hair and the scary dream, it's kind of unbelievable. And that dream wasn't just, oh, I'm scared. It was full on sobbing, and she turned it into an awareness and a gift.
I have no words. Let's hope people hear. Let's hope people make, their, assumptions and,
Yeah.
That's all we can do, right? Just share the knowledge, and I hope we all hear.
Yes.
What is there to be said, right? And thank you so much.
Thank you
so much for sharing with us that experience. And I do think that young people who went through that can really change the place around them. And this is what it's all about.
I agree. I just want to put the word out too that adults have found great value in the program. So there's always the possibility of people that are older coming out either to the field or joining us online and making use of it.
Thank you. And in announcement on our Facebook group, we have all the links to Rites of Passage program, and I can also put them in the comments right below this video.
Okay.
So people can find it. And please look into that, spread the knowledge, share the video, so maybe we can do something a little bit more in providing truth and in providing ways to deepen knowledge about ourselves.
All right. Thanks so much for having me, Marina.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day there.
You too.
Oregon.
Okay.